If you're a successful mid-career lawyer who never considered starting a law firm, then this is for you. If you're reasonably happy at your current firm, but you have a nagging feeling that you may not live the life that you hope to, if you continue on your current path, then I'm making this for you. Truth is, I'm not sure whether anyone will get any value out of this or be interested in this effort. But this is the content that I personally would have wanted more than anything when I was considering quitting my big law partnership and launching my own firm. Almost 4 years into launching my firm, I have made many mistakes and I am just getting started. I will make millions more. But I've learned a couple things along the way and I'm hoping to share them. In fact, I feel compelled to share them. I need to get this off my chest almost like a sneeze. And so I'm hoping that if only one person gets some value out of this content, then I'll consider it a success. For the first 17 years of my law practice, I was at AmLaw 100 and 200 firms, including almost 15 years at a terrific firm in Chicago, where I was a partner in its construction law group for almost 7 years, making me one of several hundred partners, along with several hundred associates. And at the time that I first started to think about law firm management, I wasn't thinking about it for me. I was actually thinking about how I might help my wife, who also was in big law before starting her own firm. I was thinking about how I might be able to help her have a better running firm and a more efficient firm and a happier lifestyle. But over time, as I was taking in all this content, mostly in the form of podcasts, I started to develop a nagging feeling that maybe it had some relevance to me. I had a nagging feeling that maybe something was not quite right with my professional situation, even though by all accounts, I had exactly what anybody would have wanted. I was working at a wonderful firm with wonderful people and had a job that I really enjoyed. Uh, but I've got 4 kids, and there's a lot that I want to do with my life. And this requires time and it requires the means to do these things. And over time, I started to just wonder whether I was on the right path. But the idea of starting something new, quitting my job, finding a new job or starting a firm was, really frightening. And I was very influenced by a terrific author and thinker named Seth Godin. In particular, his book, The Dip, which makes a lot of brilliant arguments. But one of them is that the notion that winners never quit is actually bad advice. Godin argues that strategic quitting, meaning quitting the right things, can actually be a real key to success. And specifically, you want to quit the things that don't make sense for you to hang with, and then stick with the things that do. And so, this conventional wisdom, that winners never quit, it doesn't really make sense if you think about it. Godin makes the point that if the secret to success in life were never quitting and instead putting your nose to the grindstone and pushing ahead, if that were the path to success, then how come everybody who tries that, is not successful? I can think of hundreds of brilliant big law firm attorneys with their noses to the grindstone that maybe are not achieving the success that they're looking for. And so I think that the $1 million question is, is it strategic for you to make a change? Or is it really an imperative actually for you to make a change? Or would it be unwise? Would you be better off just continuing on your current path, or maybe finding a similar path? And I'm hoping that this will help you think that question through. So I guess the first question is, should you be quitting what you're doing right now, or should you be sticking with it? And then I guess the second question is if you decide that you ought to quit, are you meant to work for someone else? Or would it be possible for you to start your own law firm and work for yourself? Now, I was shocked to learn that starting and running a law firm is easier now in 2023 than it's ever been before. That's not to say that it isn't quite hard, but it's hard in ways that were different than what I expected. At the time that I was staring over the precipice, wondering whether this crazy idea of starting my own law firm is something I should pursue. What I was worried about is client acquisition. Like many of you, who are the clients? Where are they coming from? And was I going to be able to avoid going broke, or would this starting a law firm just be a misadventure that I regretted? But what I learned is I was actually scared about the wrong things. It turned out that client acquisition and not going broke was actually much easier than I thought. If I wanted to be scared about the right things, I wished a couple years ago I had read a brilliant book by Michael Gerber called The E-Myth Revisited: Why Small Businesses Don't Work and What to Do About It. Now, this is a brilliant book, and Gerber makes the argument that the fatal assumption for many people who start businesses is that if they understand how to do technical work, then they will necessarily understand how to run a business that produces technical work. In other words, if you're a great lawyer, then you're necessarily going to understand how to run a business that produces excellent legal work. And Gerber makes the argument that assumption is not true at all. And I think that's particularly the case if you are thinking about starting a firm where you're considering growing. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with starting your own firm and just working for yourself and being a true solo and doing excellent work. There's absolutely no virtue in growth for the sake of growth. But there's a very big difference, Gerber argues, between creating a business and creating a place for you to go to work. There's a difference between being a freelancer and creating a job for yourself versus creating a business. This is something Seth Godin talks a lot about as well. And if your experience is like mine, if you're sitting there watching this video and the content is hitting home for you the way that it would have for me several years ago, you should be scared. You should feel fear. And I think that that's perfectly normal. I was very much influenced by the great author Steven Pressfield, and specifically his terrific book, The Art of War, where he talks about this notion of resistance, this resistance that we feel inside of us. Pressfield describes it as the enemy within, or a force of nature, and that this is something that stops us from doing what we ought to do. And Pressfield describes resistance as something that presents us with a series of plausible, rational justifications about why we shouldn't do our work, about why we shouldn't do the things that we're really, called to do or being pulled towards. And he argues what's particularly insidious about it is that many of these justifications are true. I mean, personally, right now, I should probably be focusing on running my law firm and taking care of my wife and my 4 kids, not creating this content. But I had to get this out of me. And after several years of planning, I've decided that I need to do it. Pressfield makes the argument that procrastination is the most common manifestation of resistance. And he argues that if you're afraid, that's good, because resistance, this thing inside of us that tends to keep us from doing what we're meant to do, is often presented as fear. And it's what keeps us from becoming who we're meant to be. Pressfield argues that combating this resistance is how you turn pro. He makes the argument that amateurs don't love the game enough to get past the resistance. But the professional, by contrast, Pressfield argues, is someone who acts in the face of their fear, because the professional knows that the fear can never be overcome. And even though I'm feeling very good about where my law firm is right now, I'm scared every day. And I don't think that that's likely to change. But I understand that it is something that I need to push through. So if you're feeling massive resistance inside of this idea of making a change, whether it's quitting your current job, or striking out on your own, I think that's good. Pressfield makes the point that the more that you're feeling that fear, that resistance, the more important your unmanifested art or project or enterprise, it is to you, and the more gratification you're going to feel when you finally get to do it. And I should also talk about how important Seth Godin's terrific book, The Icarus Deception, was for me. at the time that I was an AmLaw 200 partner, staring out over the precipice, wondering whether this crazy idea of starting my own law firm was something that I should really consider. And Godin makes the point that there is such a thing as a comfort zone, and there's such a thing as the safety zone. And he points out that, in the old economy, the way things used to be when, if you're like me, back when I started my law career, they used to be the same thing. For me, the comfort zone and the safety zone for, almost 15 years were the corner office. It was the fancy law firm, the big law partnership. It was comfortable and it was safe. But over time, I came to realize that while it continued to be quite comfortable, it no longer felt safe. I realized that it wasn't safe if I wanted to live the kind of life that I aspired to and to achieve my goals. Godin makes the argument that we are no longer in an industrial economy, but instead in a connection economy. And in this new economy, which I hope to talk about more in the future, the safety zone has changed. It's moved, but the comfort zone has not. And so Godin makes the point that recognizing that the safety zone has moved, it might be the prompt that you need to reevaluate your comfort zone. Because if you can't realign your comfort zone with today's new safety zone, you could find yourself in a lot of trouble. Now, I'm very happy about 4 years into starting my firm. I feel like I've found my new safety zone. I feel like I've aligned it with my comfort zone because I've done what Seth Godin recommends, which is becoming comfortable with the behavior that is most likely to make me safe going forward. I'm not that comfortable with recording videos and putting myself out there into the world. I've never been very comfortable with this, me, look at me culture. But I've realized that this is a very different world that we are in right now than the world that we are in when I started my law practice 22 years ago. And you have to consider whether you're willing to recognize this difference and adapt to it. A few years ago, what really pushed me over the edge towards this change that I made, in addition to many other things I'll talk about, is my realization that the years were accumulating like snowfall, silently like snowfall. And the fallout was, me getting older and further along in my career and in my life. And I became convinced that if I didn't make a change, I was going to find myself at the end of my law career, in 20 years, with grown children, and I might not be at the destination that I hoped to get to. So I hope that those of you who find what I'm saying interesting, if this is striking a chord with you, I hope that you'll continue on and listen to a few more of the things that went through my mind, both before I leapt out and started my firm and the things that I've thought about over the last 4 years. And in the event that there is one person out there who gets some value out of what I'm saying here, I'll consider it a terrific success.